everybody, I'm Tabitha, and today we're talking about reading statistics. This is the second video in a three-part series that started yesterday and finishes tomorrow. Yesterday, I posted a video where I talked about my December writing and reading goals and even my writing goals for the entirety of 2019. But I didn't talk about my year-long reading goals. That's because today we're going to talk about my year-long reading goals and all the statistics that go with them. Tomorrow, I'll be taking a look at my top recommendations for 2019 reads. If you have a TBR that's looking for new books to be added, you are not going to want to miss tomorrow's video. But let's get into today. Today I'm going to be breaking down all the statistics surrounding my 2019 reading. I'm going to look at all the different factors relating to everything that I read, and I'm going to try to see if I can figure out what affected my star rating the most, and if you can truly trust my star rating is unbiased. Let's get to it. First up, I wanted to take a look at my totals for the year. If you follow me on Goodreads, you probably already know this total, but I'll give it to you anyway. In total this year, I read 139 books, and a staggering 47,451 pages. Now, in the interest of being completely honest with you, I can tell you that on Goodreads, it looks like I read 140. That's because one audiobook I listened to contained 2 short stories. I'm counting it here as one book since they were combined into one. Goodreads counts it as 2 because it was 2 separate short stories. I liked to look at my breakdown by month of books and page numbers to see if there were any months that stood out as being amazing or terrible. So it's worth noting here that my lowest months, or the months with the lowest numbers, were September and December, where I only managed to finish 8 books. However, in September, the word count was over 3,000, meaning the books I read in September must have been a little bit longer. Speaking of if the books that I read were a little bit longer, I do also want to mention that I calculated the average page length of a book I finished in 2019, and that just happened to be 341 pages, a number that seems realistic to me, since I did read some really long books and some short stories. I also thought it was interesting, if you look at the 2 graphs for number of books read and pages read in a month, they are almost identical. You could lay them over each other and you'd notice those same patterns followed. So I think that corresponds to what I was saying, where my average really works out to be that 341. In other words, the months where I read a lot of books, it wasn't because I was reading very short ones to try to drive that number up. I stuck pretty close to that average the entire time. Then next thing I took a look at in my 2019 reading statistics was the gender of the author. Now, a lot of the books that I read in 2019 were co-authored by more than one person. So for those books, I looked at who was the primary author and what gender are they. You can see from this graph that I read slightly more books authored by females than males. But these are close enough that I would say, for me, gender is not statistically significant. In other words, I don't seek out books just because they were written by either males or females. I did also look at the gender breakdown month by month throughout the entire year. There were some months where I read heavily male-authored books, like January, and yet there were some months where I read heavily female-authored books, like October, for example. But as you saw from that original graph, it did balance out by the end. Then next thing I took a look at in my 2019 reading statistics was age category the book was intended for. You can see from this graph that exactly half of what I read in 2019 was intended for adults. Middle grades books picked up less than 10% of what I read, with young adult filling in the rest. I may try to make it a habit in 2020 to read more books that were intended for middle grades or maybe even younger. You can also expect age category to be something I look at again in many of these other categories as my statistics get a little deeper. The next thing I looked at with my 2019 reading statistics was genre. It's not going to surprise any regular watchers of this channel when they see this graph and notice it is all over the place. So this year, it turns out in 2019, the biggest section for genre for me belongs to fantasy, unlike in previous years where it's been mystery thriller. Mystery thriller did come in a close second place there. 29, almost 30% of what I read was fantasy, where 26, almost 27% of what I read was mystery thriller. The smallest sections of the pie belong to westerns, romance, and horror, where I kept only a few books in each genre. I was interested in looking at genre and age categories slammed together on the same graph. So that's exactly what you see here on this graph. So on this graph right here, the one you're looking at, adult age category books are in blue, middle grades in red, and young adult in yellow. I found it really interesting to take a look at this graph. You'll notice, for example, in fantasy, which you already know I read more books in than any other genre, it's heavily dominated by young adult books. But in mystery thriller, my second most common category, it was dominated by adult age category books. The rest of the books I read this year were pretty well spread out and distributed evenly, making this graph look a little skewed. The one poetry book I read was written for YA, the one Western book I read was written for adults, and the one graphic novel I read was also written for adults. So that makes this kind of interesting, and it turns out that young adult fantasy may top my list, but adult mystery thriller may also come pretty high. Since I read so many independent books for this channel, I also thought it would be interesting to take a look at all the books that are classified as independent, or books that were published without an agent, and what genre all of those fell under. So this graph looked at only independently published books I read in 2019. You'll notice that there are fewer categories here. What I also found interesting is that these books were dominated by science fiction. Further inspection showed me that most of the science fiction I read in 2019 was in fact independently published. It's kind of interesting. The next piece of data I wanted to look at was release years. Now this pretty graph right here is going to have every student I ever taught data analysis to commenting down below that I am giving skewed graphs. The reason I say that is because if you actually look closely at the categories along the bottom axis down here, you'll see that they are not even data spreads. That first bar represents 100 years, then 9 years, 4 years, 2 years, 1 year, and even that last bar being only a single book for an arc that is coming out in 2020. There is a reason for this skewed piece of data, other than that it makes the graph look pretty. I knew that I was going to be heavily leaning towards books that were published after 2010, and I wanted to make sure that I saw the trend of where specifically those books were coming from, besides just saying that it was in the last 9 years. So I did find it interesting to take a look at this and notice that most of the books I read in 2019 actually came from a 2-year spread of between 2016 and 2018. I did read a lot of books published in 2019, and I did read one book coming out in 2020. I also want to mention that a book I read with the earliest publication date was published in 1910. The next thing I wanted to look at, and this is important because it all comes back to this, doesn't it, is overall star rating. You can see from this graph here that it was a really good reading year. Overall, most of what I read I actually loved, rating it 4 or 5 stars. Only 11% of the books I read this year were problematic or simply not for me, earning 1 or 2 stars. The other 33%, or 1/3 of the books that I read this year, were intended for really niche audiences and scored themselves 3 stars. It's been a really good year for books. Remember, tomorrow I'll be popping right back here to this channel with a video with giving you my book recommendations coming from that large slice of the pie of books that I loved. The next graph I have for you is rather unassuming when you first look at it. This graph takes a look at the different age categories versus star rating that I gave each book on my channel. Now this is yellow representing middle grades, red representing young adult, and blue representing adult age category books. Down at the bottom you'll notice that these represent bars for 1 and 2 star, 3 star, or 4 and 5 star. So what you should be doing here is comparing, for example, blue in all 3 bars, the amount of red in all 3 bars, and the amount of yellow in all 3 bars. The interesting thing to note about this is that the pieces are essentially the same size all the way across the graph, meaning that I don't seem to have a bias when it comes to a certain age category. In other words, it doesn't matter who the author intended to be the reader or the age of the intended reader of the book. That doesn't affect my rating. I don't, for example, rate young adult books higher and adult books lower. It's pretty evenly spread all the way across, meaning I'm being really fair when I rate books based on age category. The next thing I wanted to take a look at was whether or not release year of a book had any effect on my star rating at all. So I had to use a scatter plot here because my data ranges from a release year of 1910 all the way to a release year of 2020 with multiple entries for certain years. So this scatter plot here across the bottom has release years and up the side has star ratings, starting with 1 at the bottom and going to 5 all the way at the top. The blue dots each represent one book that I read in the year. So you'll notice most of the data is scattered, kind of grouped together around this end, which means higher release years, which matches with what we saw in our earlier release year graph. But you may also notice there doesn't appear to be any trend here. In other words, the data isn't structured in an upward arc or a downward arc. It doesn't seem to be clustered together at all. It's pretty random and spread all over the place. That tells me when I analyze this data that I seem to be unbiased in relation to release year as well. In other words, I don't tend to rate books lower just because they're old or higher just because they're old. In fact, I'm pretty unbiased and fair when I rate these books no matter what their release year was. And that's something I'm pretty proud of. The next thing I took a look at was whether or not genre had any bias on my star rating. Now I have to be honest, if you had asked me before I made this which graph I thought would show the most bias, this would have been the one that I chose. Because aren't most people really drawn to one specific genre and they know what they like? Let's see how mine did. Here on this particular graph, you'll notice across the bottom I have all the genres that I've already identified that I read. Blue bars represent books in that genre that I gave 1 or 2 stars. Red bars represent books in that genre that I gave 3 stars. And yellow bars represent books in that genre that I gave 4 or 5 star ratings to. You'll notice that there are no genres here where I gave an unusual amount of low stars in relation to the number of high stars. Most of these are pretty balanced and seem to be in accordance with what you see on my overall star graph. The beauty of this graph is that it shows that I can love a book even if I don't read a lot in that genre. You'll notice that when you go to, for example, to Westerns or poetry, where the only book I read is actually rated pretty high. Evidently, I'm the kind of reader who can pick up one book in a genre and love it anyway, even though it's not a genre I'm automatically drawn to. Again, that's something I'm really proud of. It seems like this graph is saying, when it comes to genre, I am not biased. I can judge a book fairly no matter what genre it was written in. This matches overall with what I've been saying, which is that I really truly will read anything. The last thing I wanted to take a look at with my 2019 reading statistics had to do with independently published books. If I ask people why they don't read more independent books, a lot of people will honestly admit that it's because they're afraid independent books won't be as good of a quality. Well, in 2019, I read a lot of independently published books. So I took a look at all those books that were classified as independent and what star rating I gave them. This graph right here shows that the percentage of books that I loved, even though they were independent, is not lower. In fact, it's higher than the percentage of traditionally published books that I gave 4 or 5 stars to. In fact, it appears that my data is skewed up. In other words, that more of the books that I read by independent authors I actually loved. That's really cool. That is a direct reflection of the fact that good quality, well-edited independent books do exist. And also that this channel is one that reviews those books and brings them to you so that you don't miss them. Remember, tomorrow I'm going to be recommending my top book recommendations for 2019 in each genre. And based on this graph, I would say it is possible you're going to see some independently published books come up. I can't wait. Okay, that's it for me on the 139 books that I read this year. It's been a fun year. I got to review for NetGalley, Book Sirens, Hidden Gems, and review requests right here on this channel. I think the data has shown that you can trust me to be an unbiased reviewer. It seems as though gender, release year, genre, age category, none of that seems to have any effect on me. A good book is a good book, and I can enjoy one in any of those categories. Stick around tomorrow so that you find out what my top 4 recommendations are in each genre I can recommend to you. Drop a comment so I know you're here. Hit subscribe and tap that little bell so you know when I'm back. Keep plotting the path to your dreams, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye!